Welcome to the next in our online conversation series. My name is Paula Gooder and I'm Canon Chancellor and Director of Learning here at St Paul's Cathedral. This time I'm talking to the Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, who is an Episcopal priest. She's Canon Theologian at Washington National Cathedral and this year is visiting professor at Harvard Divinity School. I do hope you enjoy our conversation. Kelly, it's really lovely to be talking to you today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
One of the things I want to start by talking about is a little bit about you. There'll be various people in our audience who haven't heard of you, don't know much about you. So if I can introduce you a little bit to them, that would be lovely. So let's start by saying, where in the United States were you born, and something about your experiences growing up?
Yes, thank you. I was born in Dayton, Ohio, which is in the Midwest of the United States. And I always like to say that Dayton is a good place to be from, with my emphasis always on from, because it was then and remains today not a very diverse community, ethnically, culturally, and otherwise. And now Dayton, which was sort of an industrial factory city in my growing up, is now really a dead city, and that many people have moved out of central Dayton, if you will, or Dayton proper. But anyway, it was a wonderful place to grow up and a wonderful time in Dayton. I have two sisters and a brother, so I'm the third in line growing up. And we grew up in a very sort of close-knit community because it was a close-knit sort of Black professional community in Dayton, Ohio. And so there were numerous persons who we called aunt and uncle, and it wouldn't be until almost adulthood when we figured out, oh, aren't really related. But that is a part of sort of the Black cultural tradition, right? And in the Black church, where we have sort of related by not so much blood lines, but sort of blood ties and kinship, what we call fictive kin. So we had a lot of aunts and uncles, and it was just a wonderful community in which to grow up in that regard. I grew up in the church, born and raised Episcopalian, grew up in the only Black Episcopal church in Dayton, which was St. Margaret's Episcopal Church. Grew up at a time when desegregating schools was in the 70s becoming quite an issue in the United States. And it was the case in Dayton as well. And so there was the debate on whether or not we would bus kids, we called it busing, bus kids out of their proper school district, so to create a more racially balanced school. Well, Dayton, for the most part, the people of Dayton didn't support that. And so I grew up in that period where, once again, I grew up through the 60s, was a teenager in the 70s, so was very aware of all of the racial uprisings, the racial unrest, because of the civil rights struggle. And so for simply Black citizens to be treated as citizens and to be respected as human beings, whether it meant our school choices or even rights to vote, etc. So I grew up very aware of that, even if as a child I didn't quite understand what was going on, but I certainly remember the realities of that. And I'll end with this story that sort of marked not simply my childhood, but my vocational journey in some respects. So now, sort of two stories. I remember one day asking my father, what did we do as Black people to be treated so badly? I said, why do white people dislike us so? And I don't remember the answer that my father gave at the time, but what I do remember was continuing to wrestle with that question as a child. I was about 7 or 8 years old. And I don't know if it was a week, a day, or how long it took that the answer sort of came to me. And I went back to my father as if we were having this continuous conversation. And I could see it like it was yesterday. We were going out somewhere and I said, Daddy, I figured out the answer to my question. And Dad said, to what question? And I said, what we did that makes white people treat us so badly? And Daddy said, oh, what? And I said, we did nothing. I said, it just happens to be us. It could be anybody else. Little did I know at the time that it wasn't just us. But that was important for me because I came to understand that we did nothing wrong, and I couldn't voice what white racism was or what white supremacy was at the time. That was the beginning of that. Because can you imagine thinking as a 7 or 8 year old that there was something about you that was wrong? And so that was very significant in my growing up. And of course, I didn't know then, but it would continue the trajectory of my work. The last thing I'll say, and then shut up, giving you this long answer, was that I remember we were going downtown and I was sitting in the backseat of the car with my parents and we were moving through Dayton's so-called inner city. And it was a cold, rainy, dreary evening. And we were at a stoplight. And I remember looking out of the window and seeing two children, a little boy and a little girl, that I assumed in my 7 or 8 year old mind that they were brother and sister and that they were about my age. And they weren't dressed properly for the weather. And so I assumed them to be poor. And I remember crying. And I said, one day I made a vow to myself that I'm going to come back and get those children. And in my mind, I thought I'd grow up, get old, they'd stay little, and I could actually come back and rescue those children. Of course, I grew up and knew that wasn't a reality, but I've always held myself accountable to those children and children like them. And so that, again, shaped the rest of my vocational journey.
And that brings me on beautifully to my next question, which is about your calling to ordained ministry. So you've been ordained as an Episcopal priest for a good number of years, and we won't ask how many, but a good number.
That's okay. It's going on 42 years now, right?
Wow, a really long time. And I love that story of the children. You're being held responsible to the children. Has that been what shaped your ministry?
Yes, it definitely has. I loved when I was growing up, I loved going to church. So much so that on those Sunday mornings when my parents may not be going to church, I would wake them up, much to the despair of my siblings, to get them to take me to church. And I would go to the 8 o'clock service, Sunday school in between, and I think the next service was at 10 o'clock. And I loved the rector of our church at that time. His name was Father Cochran. But I loved hearing stories about Jesus. And the story that really struck me the most was the story of Jesus being born in a manger. And I loved the song, Away in a Manger, no room for his head, the little Lord Jesus laid down. I can't remember now the words, but anyway, the Away in the Manger song. And I would always wonder, how could anyone allow a little baby to be born in a barn in a manger? And somehow in my mind, I connected that baby born in the manger with those little children that I saw. I didn't know what theology was for a long time until my college years, but that was the beginning, right, of a theological journey. And so I made that connection between Jesus and those children, what Howard Thurman would later talk about, Jesus and the disinherited. And so that was the beginning of my ministry. In terms of my call to ordination, I love church. And at the time that I was growing up, of course, women weren't allowed to be ordained, and little girls weren't even allowed to serve at the altar as acolytes. But I always wanted to be an acolyte, and so we had a pool table at home in our basement, and I would go home after church, take the little pool cue, and the pool table would be the altar, and I would act like I was an acolyte. And so that was, and I remember my dad saying once to his mother on the phone, she's going to grow up to be a missionary one day. Those were the beginnings of sort of the call, which of course I wouldn't recognize then. I just knew that I loved the church and wanted to be an engaged and active participant in the church, and couldn't be because I was a girl. Fast forward, when I decided, I went to seminary not to become ordained, but to study with James Cone, the sort of pioneer of contemporary Black theology. But I realized then that there was something missing, and it was my ordination and the call to the priesthood. And I was afraid to follow that call, not because I didn't believe that God was calling me in that direction, but because I knew the Episcopal Church, and it was a white church, and it was a church women were just being ordained, and I thought I was committed to those children. I was committed to the Black community, and I didn't want to begin a ministry that would take me away from that commitment, and where I would end up having to fight a structure because I was Black and female just to be ordained. But obviously, the end of the story is that I did indeed become ordained.
Yes, God had other plans for you.
God always has the last laugh, I tell you.
Certainly does. So you've talked there about how much you love the church. And one of my great passions is the writings of Paul. And I'm fascinated by how Paul writes to churches with the great kind of passion on his heart. If you were to adopt, be a latter day Paul and to write a letter to your church at the moment, what would you say?
Yeah, good question. And I think I would say what I have, as of late, been saying quite a bit. And two things. First of all, that we call ourselves church is aspirational. We need to live into what that means, which means reflecting and showing at least a glimpse, right, of God's just future, of God's beloved community. Which means the second thing that I would say in that letter is that we are a faith tradition with a cross at the center of it. And it is time that we act like that. For Jesus did not get on the cross. He was not crucified because he prayed too much, though the fact that he prayed helped him to bear the cross, or that he remained neutral in the face of injustice, or that he remained silent. Jesus was on the cross because he stood for God's promised just future, where every single person would be treated as the sacred human beings that they are. And therefore, he stood against anything that opposed that. And as he did that, the cross lets us know that the sort of meaning of God's justice always begins in the struggle with those who are on the underside of justice. So Jesus entered into utter solidarity, which the cross makes clear, utter solidarity with the crucified classes of people of his day. That is, those people who were crucified by the realities of death in their own time because they were not respected as the sacred human beings that they were, the marginalized, the oppressed, the disinherited. That's what I'd say to the church.
Sounds pretty good to me, and much needed, I would say, at the moment. Then I'd like to move on to preaching, because
Mm,
the first time I met you, you were preaching at a dear mutual friend's consecration in Canterbury Cathedral.
yes,
So when Anderson Jeremiah was being
that's
consecrated as
right.
bishop. And I was absolutely mesmerized by your preaching. I still sticks with me. And one of the things that I was really struck by was that what you do that we mostly don't do in Britain is you married the performance of the preaching with the content
Mm.
of the preaching. And I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about how you think into that rhetoric of preaching.
Well, first of all, thank you. And I am humbled by that anytime that anyone would listen to me preach, let alone remember what I preach. That's very humbling and scary. And so that I will also say that there has never been a time that I have stepped into any pulpit that I have not literally had butterflies. Preaching is one of the things that makes me most nervous and most anxious, because it's even more than simply lecturing to a class. You have the audacity to say that you have something to say that perhaps people should hear about the Word of God, and that to me is audacious. And so I'm scared and move into that space with fear and trembling. And I don't know, I've had uh, good uh, mentors in terms of preaching. I studied with one of the great preachers of our time, James Forbes. I studied homiletics from him while I was in seminary. And of course, there is a great preaching tradition in the Black faith tradition. And so they're great preachers. I don't know that at all that I consciously bring any of that into the pulpit with me, because what I tell people is just be yourself. And that's what I try to do. And don't realize, I talk with my hands, as you can see, all of those things are who I am. And so I just try to bring that into the pulpit with me, and just bring myself and engage in, I hope, sort of conversation, if you will, sort of conversational rhetoric, if you will, with the people. So yeah, and I'm, no doubt influenced by my own sort of wider Black faith heritage. But yeah, I'm nervous, and I just try to be me.
It's one of the pieces of advice I often give people who are starting preaching is you need to find your own voice.
Yeah,
I can't
exactly.
preach like you preach, and you can't preach like I preach, and we none of us can preach like some of the greats, Martin Luther King
Right,
Jr. We can't
right.
preach like that. We preach like we preach. Um, can you talk a little bit about how you found out how you preach? How did you find your voice in preaching?
Oh, I don't know, y'all. These are good questions and things that I haven't really consciously thought about. Uh, I think it just took, I look back at like 40 years ago and some of my early preaching, I'm like, oh, uh, and, I guess you just grow. Like, you just sort of, the more confident you are, let's say, in uh, what you want to say, and the more prepared. One of the things that I preaching preparing a sermon is the other reason why I don't crave preaching. It's like, oh my gosh, it just takes so much time, and time well spent, I hope. But I think, because it is a sacred space to get into that pulpit, it is sacred rhetoric. And so that we have to be responsible for what we say and accountable to God. And so I don't know. I think just over the years of gaining more confidence and preparation and, getting old, I, I, I've never consciously thought about that. And there are times that I feel less nervous than other times.
And various people listening will not be preachers, but will be people who listen to preaching regularly. Any tips for listening well to preaching?
Well, you know what? Let's hope that the person who is preaching entices you into listening, right? And I think we have to, it's part of the preacher's task to entice the listener. And so, I'll just leave it there.
Yes. One of my best tips I was given when I was having a grumble about a preacher one day, and the person who I was speaking to said, "Well, did you pray at the start of the sermon?" And I went, "Well,
Yeah.
no, it's their job to pray." And they said to me, "Well, you should pray at the start of when you listen to a sermon. Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." And see what God wants to say. And I
Love it.
found it the most powerful thing. And I must confess that sometimes God speaks through the words of the sermon. And sometimes God speaks despite the words of the sermon. But no, but nevertheless, I always find God speaking in some way or another. I hear something.
Yeah, but and the point you're making is a wider point, that the preaching moment is not the only moment in worship.
Mm.
And so to me there's a wider question, and that is how you enter worship and how you prepare yourself for worship. And there I do think you prepare yourself in prayer and you center yourself. And so it's not as if you're going in to be entertained, right? You are going in to this is your moment to connect in a different way with God. And so it's not so much preparing for the sermon as what it means to enter into a place of worship and prepare yourself for worship. And that is, to me, a centering experience, whatever that experience looks like for you. It is, in some regard, about prayer. Preaching is only a moment of that. And sometimes I say, thank God. And I mean that for myself. There are other things that go on in worship. It could be the liturgy itself. It could be the music, or it could be the person sitting next to you. And so you ask that God would open you up to God's presence, however that presence may come.
So can I move now on to your writing? And you've written various books, and they're all in the area of the experience of being a Black person in the church, in the world, in the modern context. If you were to summarize your key points in your writing, how would you summarize them?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, you're right. That I write from out of my experience, because that's what theology is. Theology is about faith, seeking understanding. And so it just doesn't emerge in my head. And you note from my writings that there are usually questions that I am wrestling with. And these are questions typically about the justice of God. And so sort of the theme of my writing is that God is just. And that every single solitary human being, in all of the many ways in which God has created them in their uniqueness, are indeed children of God, and that God respects and wants all of us to be able to live into the full potential of whomever it is that God has created us to be. And so, what does it mean than to talk about to the justice of God? How does God's justice enter into our own historical context? What does justice look like in a time when Black people are just struggling to survive and to be free? And so if talk about a theme of my writing, it is about trying to understand the meaning of God's justice and the complicated realities of injustice of which we find ourselves.
Can you say a little bit about how you understand what God's justice is? If you were to be in a context and you can say, yes, in this context, I see God's justice at work. What would be the markers of it?
Yeah. Well, first marker is that, you know, God's justice means that people are not assaulted by the violence of injustice. And when we think about violence, we have to think about that not simply as that direct act that is an assault upon a person's body, et cetera, sort of that direct violence. We have to talk about cultural violence, the ways in which our religious culture, social culture, other realities of culture don't affirm the humanity and the person of another, right? And so we can talk about white supremacist culture and the way in which it holds up as normative that which is white and not that which is non-white. That's cultural violence, ideological violence that suggests that somebody is less than who they are. And then systemic and structural violence. So God's justice looks like those places where that people are not assaulted by that kind of violence, the interactive realities of violence. So how does that show up? It shows up when people are struggling against that. It shows up when people are being affirmed. It shows up in those small places where those people who have lived on the underside of justice can say, ah, that looks like justice. And in my thing, I always say to people, look, you know, Martin Luther King, borrowing from Theodore Parker, said that the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice. I do believe that it bends toward the justice of God. Our task is to get on the arc and to do those acts of justice which affirm the sacredness of other human beings.
And I'd like to kind of move now on to your most recent book, Resurrection Hope, which I hugely enjoyed. And I'd like to begin, it was kind of themed around the experiences of your son being Black in America. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? Because that was one of kind of the really gripping things about the book, was the kind of the telling of his stories and his experiences.
Yes, thank you. And he's now quite an adult. So, yet he and I still have, even as he is an adult and 30 now, he and I still have these conversations. And so, my son would often text me and ask me, particularly these questions. He grew up as a teenager through Trayvon Martin. Many of you may or may not remember Trayvon Martin, but he was a young Black teenager that was killed by a civilian, a white civilian, who said that he killed him because he felt threatened. Trayvon Martin was 17 years old at the time and kind of slight for his age, and was killed 70 feet or so away from his home, going home. And the person who killed him said that he was standing his ground, and he was not found guilty for murdering Trayvon. That was the beginning of the first instance of Black Lives Matter movement. My son was a year or so older than Trayvon at the time, so he's coming sort of into his own during this time. And then you will know, in our country, we had right around Trayvon then a lot of other high profile killings of young Black people, murders of young Black people who were doing nothing but being who they are, to being teenagers and doing nothing that was threatening. And so Desmond, that's my son's name, was asking these questions of, because he knows my writing and my work. And, so you talk about the Black Christ. How's the Black Christ helping us now? You talk about the justice of God. What does the justice of God look like for us now? Those were biting questions. And then, of course, we had the election. We had our first Black president when all of President Obama, when all of these things were really happening in a most egregious way. Trayvon Martin, all of that happened when Obama was president. And so my son's trying to bring all of that together. And that's a pattern in our history. When Black people make any progress, there's always this sort of backlash. And we saw that backlash after Obama. We had the first election of President Trump, who ran on a Make America Great Again agenda, which I've said in the book was a very white, racist, white supremacist agenda. And again, my son is asking me questions of like, how are we, where is God in all of this? And so, and then these conversations are going on over a period of time. And then we finally, not finally, but then the world experiences COVID. And as it was globally, it certainly was in the United States that the COVID pandemic impacted most severely marginalized communities, in particular the Black community. At the same time that we have the COVID pandemic disproportionately killing Black human beings, we have George Floyd, which I know people in the UK know about because that created international attention. How do we talk about the justice of God and that? Is God racist? How much are Black people supposed to endure? These were the questions, and his questions became my questions. And this was his question reminded me of asking my father when I was 7 or 8 years old, why do white people hate us so? What did we do? And that was really, which I didn't know then, a theological question. I'm asking, where's God? God, how much of this are we supposed to endure and still believe in you and still believe that you are just? And so while my son's asking these questions, for me, it becomes almost an existential crisis. Is God just? So I was at, as I've said in the book, the brink of despair. The words of W.E.B. Du Bois, a great Black philosopher, sociologist, etc. He also wrote poetry, and he had a litany in where he pleads to God, "Keep thou not silent, O God." And those words were echoing in my mind, "Keep not thou silent, O God." So this book, Resurrection Hope, was a journey to try to understand the justice of God. And more significantly, it was a journey for me to try to hang on to my faith and to try to find hope somewhere in that. And that journey was because of the questions of my son.
And a few years on, here we still are. And it feels quite hard at the moment, doesn't it, to cling on to hope. Looking at the world, looking at the state of politics, looking at conflict. There's conflict in Europe again for the first time since the 1940s. There's the war in the Holy Land, and just looking around, it is very easy to tip into despair.
Yes.
What would you say then and now to that feeling?
What I said then is what I say now. And people, it's really are asking this question all the time now, as our country is seeing sort of another. We are in the Trump administration, Trump presidency again, and a lot of the hardships that and inhumanities that have come along with that. And so people are asking all the time, how do you hope? And hope shows up where we show up, fighting for justice. Hope shows up when we show up, making clear that the way things are is not the way they are destined to be, that the way things are is not God's promise for us. And as long as we can believe that, and as long as we can show up fighting against that which would suggest that the way things are just and the way they're supposed to be, then there's where hope is found. And, for me, as I say in the book, Resurrection Hope, I found hope. I will remember, and as coming through the Easter season, the words that came to me that sort of pulled me out of my despair during the time of the writing of my book were Jesus' words at the time of his resurrection, when he went to his disciples and he said, "Meet me in Galilee." And those words kept playing over in my mind. And said, "Meet me in Galilee." What does that mean? So taking that seriously, where I'm a great Anglican. Anglicans, we don't so much believe in all these religious experiences like that. But I listened to that in my sort of resonating in my head and my soul. And it was the time, as I said before, of the Black Lives Matter movement during the first Trump administration. And I live outside of Washington, D.C., there was Black Lives Matter Plaza. And we're in the middle of COVID, and people are protesting against the indiscriminate killings of young Black people. And to me, Galilee meant going down to Black Lives Matter Plaza. And anyone that knows me knows that I was a germaphobe way before the pandemic. And so my going out of my house anywhere during the pandemic is a miracle. But I did. I put on 2 masks and I said, well, it's outside. And I told my spouse, I'm only going to be there for a little bit and I'll just move through. So I'm not too close to anyone, but I went down. And when I went down there, I found myself laughing, because Black Lives Matter Plaza, you can't be in the White House and not see it. It's right sort of out in front of the White House. Here these people were, protest, a diverse group of people, all ages, old, young, and in between, all ethnicities and colors, and protesting in each in their own ways. There was music, some people were chanting, there was drumming, there was singing, there were signs. It was just a wonderful thing to see. And I laughed and I thought, oh my gosh, the architect of the Make America Great Again movement he has to see this. And he had cleared out that plaza few days earlier, as of course made news, and so it was like, oh my gosh, I laughed and I said, this is God's last laugh, because to me the resurrection is God's last laugh. It's God saying, ha ha ha, death will not have the last word. Ha ha ha, crucifixions will not have the last word. Ha ha ha, you thought you had me, but justice, my justice, will always win out. What I saw in Black Lives Plaza was God's last laugh. Ha ha ha, this injustice will not have the last word. And that's where I found hope. Hope is when we laugh with God.
That is an absolutely fabulous place to end. Thank you so much, Kelly. It's been lovely talking to you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.